Thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be with you again. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and so the liturgy is, it's always fun to come back to that. We're in a church where it's not as prevalent, and so it's good for my soul to be in a place like that this morning. So I don't think I've ever been so acutely aware of my ability to influence another person as I have been this past year in being a mom for the first time. My son Declan just celebrated his first birthday a couple weeks ago. And for those of you that are parents or grandparents, you know this very well. Well, a few weeks ago, my husband Dan and I were in the kitchen, and Dan was holding Declan, and he has this thing that he does where he leans in the direction he wants you to go. And so he was leaning in a direction of the kitchen, and so Dan kind of followed and took him over there, and we couldn't figure out what it was that he wanted until Dan stopped at our Keurig coffee maker. You guys aware of what a Keurig is? It's a coffee maker that basically makes 1 cup of coffee at a time. And it has a lever that you pull up, and you put this little pot of coffee grounds in it, and then you pull it back down and push the button, and it brews your cup of coffee. Well, when Dan got to the Keurig, Declan stuck his hand out, and he pulled the lever up, and took the little pot out, put it back in, put it down, and pressed the button. And Dan and I looked at each other astonished, like, where did he learn that? And Dan says to me, did you show him how to use this? I said, no. Did you show him how to use this? No. Well, what we had failed to realize was that for the past couple of months, Declan had been sitting in his high chair every morning watching my husband make his cup of coffee from the Keurig. And Dan was having this sort of influence on Declan that he was totally unaware of, but my son obviously picked up on it. Well, it's kind of a silly example in a very small way of the ways in which we influence each other. And I hope that Dan and I influence Declan a little bit more than just making a cup of coffee. But in case we don't, he knows how to make a very mean cup of joe. But influence doesn't just happen between parents and children. It happens among teachers and students, among friends and mentors, family members, co-workers. Every relationship that you have has the potential to be an influential one. The nature of relationships is such that we have this power to influence each other. And as he does on many topics, Jesus has a pretty strong opinion about the ways in which we go about influencing each other. So from this passage in Mark 8, the Pharisees, who were the religious elite of the day, they come to Jesus. And it's not the first time, but it's a very significant time because it reveals their distrust of Jesus and their trust in their own abilities and their own societal power that they have gained. They ask Jesus for a sign from heaven. This could be interpreted as like a sign in the sky, a miracle in the sky, or it could be something just really impressive to really find out where Jesus is getting his power to do miracles from. And this is significant because they were asking Jesus to do something that they knew only God himself could do. But Jesus knew that even if they had this sign in the sky, if he had given them the thing that they were looking for, they wouldn't have actually believed that he was the Messiah, that he was God. You see, they were threatened by Jesus, and they saw him as a threat to the power that they had gained, and so they wanted to trap him. They wanted to make a fool out of Jesus. And while Jesus could have very easily given in to what they were asking him to do to prove himself to them, he replies with the equivalent of a deep groan. He's basically saying, are you kidding me? Have you not been there? Have you not seen all of the miracles that I've been doing? All of the signs, of pointing to who I am and where I get my power. See, he doesn't waste his time arguing and just tells them plainly, you won't find a sign because you haven't believed up until this point everything that I've been doing. Then he gets into the boat and he begins to teach his disciples. They're talking about not having any bread. And Jesus begins to warn them about the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And I love this line. The disciples are very confused why Jesus starts talking about yeast as he gets into the boat. And they say, they think they're really clever, basically. And they say, it's because we have no bread. And Jesus looks at them and is like, again, are you kidding me? He says, you don't get it either. Don't you have eyes? Don't you have ears? Haven't you been with me? Haven't you seen everything that I've done? Haven't you heard everything that I've taught you? And then he points them back to two specific miracles, two specific instances where Jesus showed them who he was and where he got his power to influence from. The feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And you know what? I find this a bit comforting that the disciples don't get it. Because it often takes Jesus a lot of times to get through to me when he's speaking to me. And you see, to understand this, we need to understand the significance of these feedings. The feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6, just 2 chapters before our passage, was to a mainly Jewish audience. And these Jews were sincerely wanting to listen to Jesus. They really wanted to hear what he had to say about this different way of living in the kingdom. And then the feeding of the 4,000 was to a mainly Gentile audience. People who had picked up on Jesus a little bit and were curious because he was different than the Pharisees. He was different than the Jewish people of the day. And in both instances, it says this about Jesus. It says that he had compassion on the crowd of people. You see, he didn't care who they were, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, whether they had standing in society, whether they could help Jesus gain more power or not. He merely had compassion on them. And all he knew about them was that, well, they were getting hungry. If you're like me, I'm not very pleasant to be around when I'm very hungry. And so both times he uses the disciples to feed them. Jesus could have used his power to create bread out of nothing or fish out of nothing, but he takes what the disciples have and uses them to feed the people. See, he makes the miracle one of compassion instead of one of arrogance. He makes it about grace rather than boosting his own ego. He takes what the disciples have and uses it to feed the people, and he diffuses the attention from the power of the miracle to providing for the people. And so Jesus asked the disciples, do you have ears to hear? Don't you have eyes to see? Don't you see what I was doing in the miracles of the feedings? I was using my influence, using my power to serve people with compassion. And so his warning to the disciples to stay away from the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod is a warning against using their influence, against using their power for the wrong reason, for putting themselves on a pedestal, for gaining popularity, for using the influence that they had to keep others from getting close to God. And it was a warning from using their power to get ahead. You see, this was the way of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They were using their power to influence just to make sure that their own egos were fed, to make sure that Their own livelihoods were provided for, taken care of, without consideration to anyone else around them. And this is why Jesus says that they won't be given a sign. They're too focused on themselves and on their influence towards self-serving ways that they won't be able to see God in their midst. They're merely threatened by Jesus and his ability to take away their power and his ability to reveal that they didn't actually have all that much influence to begin with. One commentator calls it their permeating influence to exclude others. Jesus warns his disciples, do not be like this. He says, follow my example, the ways of using compassion and service to influence others. He basically says, open your eyes, open your ears, and see the ways of true influence. And I think it's the same message for us today. Jesus says to us, open your eyes, open your ears, follow the ways of the kingdom and of influence in the name of compassion and of grace and in the name of service and sacrifice. See, the influence of Jesus and the influence of Herod and the Pharisees is the difference between a mirror and a window. The Pharisees were just interested in using their power for themselves, and their influence and their power merely reflected their own egos. It was like their influence resembled a mirror. They merely wanted to influence others to get ahead, and so they were just left with a reflection of themselves. Jesus instead was more interested about using his influence and power for the sake of others, and especially for those that he could lift up and those he could influence with his compassion, with his grace, with his service. Jesus' influence is like a window. You can still see your own reflection when you look in a window if you look closely enough, but that's not the point. The point of a window is to see what's beyond the window. Windows open up and project outward and forward into the world, and this is the way of Jesus' influence. It always expands to help others. It always looks forward. It always looks out towards those who are in need and what's best for them. And this is the way that Jesus has called us into. He says, use the influence I have given you for the sake of building others up, not just for your own good. Use your influence for the sake of service, for forgetting yourself and building into others. Use your influence in the power of God to point to Jesus, not to yourself. Do this and your life will become more expansive, more forward-looking, more open. So, how do we do this? What does this selfless, service-oriented influence look like? Maybe for you, it means starting by taking a look at those you influence most. It could be your kids or your spouse. It could be your in-laws, your next-door neighbors, a coworker you spend a lot of time with. And then take a look at the ways in which you're influencing them. Is your influence out of a sense of wanting to control them, or of wanting to see them flourish into who God has made them to be? Is your influence out of a sense of power and what you can get out of the relationship? Or is it merely to see those you're influencing bettered? Are you influencing out of a sense of service, knowing that your impact may never be known, may never be publicized, may never be thanked, but serving anyway? Then, after asking yourself these questions, think of ways in which you can serve this week. Is there a response that you always have when your spouse annoys you? I have one. Maybe ask God to help you have a different response in those times, and think of a way you can serve your spouse instead. Or are there dishes in your sink at home? Maybe, as a surprise to the person who always does the dishes, you stop and take 15 minutes to do it this week. Is there a teacher or a student of yours that you know who's having a hard time? Take some extra time to be with them this week. Maybe it's a kind word to a coworker that you've had some conflict with. Maybe your next door neighbor's lawn needs a little trim while you're mowing your own. You see, the ways of influence, they start really small. And it may seem like they're insignificant, but that's how influence starts. It starts small and then ripples out. The more we serve, the deeper the ripples can go and the ways in which we point others to Jesus. Let me tell you a couple of stories of ripples of influence that I've experienced. A few months ago, my husband, Dan, who is a youth pastor, had his leaders from the youth group over to our home. And we had this great barbecue, and we made tacos, and we had all this extra food left over. They were college students, and so we kind of over-anticipated for how much they eat, even though they eat a lot. And at one point in the evening, Dan kind of disappeared, and I thought, I wonder where he is since he's hosting his leaders at our home, and here I am by myself. And about 20 minutes later, he showed back up, and I said, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Oh, I went next door to Anna and Jesus' house." And I said, "Okay, are they all right?" And he said, "Yeah, I wanted to bring them the extra food that we had." Well, you see, Anna and Jesus, they struggle to make ends meet every single month, and we knew this. And Dan took the time to wrap up the food that we probably weren't going to eat anyway and take it over to them to bless them. These ripples of influence, they start small. And then a few weeks ago, Dan took his youth group down to downtown San Diego for kind of an urban missions day. And it was really to expose the students to poverty, to homelessness, and to show them that they could do something about it. Well, there's one student named Aubrey who throughout the day was pretty shy. I think it was a little bit of a shock to her what was happening. And after a long afternoon of walking the streets and connecting with some homeless people and praying for them, the group was getting ready to go back to the van to leave. Well, Aubrey saw one last homeless woman, and she stopped and asked her if there was anything that she could pray for her for. And the woman was very grateful and very gracious, and she said, "Yes, will you please pray that I find some warm clothes because it's getting very cold." Well, Aubrey, who's a 15-year-old, decided she wasn't just going to pray for the woman. She took off her sweatshirt right then and there and gave it to her. And the story doesn't end there. This is the coolest part of it. So the other students had all witnessed this, and some other leaders had all witnessed this. And they decided on their own that they wanted to do a sweater drive. And so their goal was to collect 100 sweaters in 2 weeks, and that they were going to go back down and walk the streets and give these out to these homeless people. Well, they got pretty enthusiastic about it, and in 3 weeks they collected 275 sweatshirts for these homeless people. I mean, it was so neat every single week to see these high school students bringing in bags and bags and bags. I mean, one kid brought in like 56 sweatshirts, you know. And it just was so inspiring. But the crazy thing is, Aubrey had no idea the amount of influence that she had. It was a simple act of compassion, a simple act of service. And the ripples are going way beyond anything that she could have even imagined. And she didn't do it to influence. She did it out of compassion and out of service. And those are the ways that we are called to serve. You see, this way of influence is totally countercultural, but it's the way to true freedom in our lives. And using our influence and power for others by the ways that Jesus calls us to, we're following the way of the window rather than the way of the mirror. The way of the window, it's this expansive life for the sake of others. Will this way be hard sometimes? And most of the time, yes, it will, because it goes against our nature to be self-centered. But the more that we make this type of influence a habit, the easier it will become. The same is with this selfless way of service. The more you do it, the more character will be built in you, and it will be easier to choose this way, to choose the way of influence in the name of Jesus. And not only will it become easier, but others will see and will be inspired to follow in that way as well, as I have been with Aubrey's example. So may the influence that you have on others this week be worked out so that it becomes easier and easier each time that we choose to serve. And so that the ways of Jesus become our ways of life as well. And may we be a people of God who use our influence for the sake and the service of others, creating these expansive ripples of influence to point others to Christ. Amen?
Amen.